Telling the untold stories to promote equity and justice. May 31st and June 1st, just about 3 weeks ago, marked the 100th anniversary of one of the worst massacres in US history, and certainly the worst in the 20th century. You heard some of the horrific details in the reading I just read to you, and Judy is going to provide more when she speaks. But I wanted to give you a little bit of the background of what was going on in the US at that time. So right after World War I, there was this intense climate of racial terror throughout the United States. Probably the most prominent example of that is that the Ku Klux Klan was often a major part of parades in the United States, in Memorial Day, Flag Day, 4th of July parades, both in the North and the South. So that gives you a sense of where the zeitgeist was at the time. There were regular lynchings, both in the North and the South again, and they were celebrated. People by the hundreds and sometimes the thousands would come out to watch it, and families would pack lunches to come and sit and watch such a gruesome event. Of course, they were published widely in the newspapers. And as we know very clearly, the Jim Crow laws were strictly enforced in the South, meaning that blacks and whites were pretty much segregated in all the cities. It was a climate where unbelievable injustice happened right out in the open, and no one did anything to stop it or even call it out as evil or call it out as the evil it was, probably because of fear. I mean, obviously, African Americans were victims by the hundreds, thousands, and they're not going to raise their hand and talk about it. And European Americans who knew the truth still did nothing about it. You know, in May, the interfellowship discussion groups that I led, we both read this book together and discussed it on 2 sessions, and we watched one of the documentaries that are out there. And in this particular documentary, there was someone who was alive as a child and saw it firsthand was talking about the horrific events that were going on. And then she kept interjecting, how could people be so mean? She said, we knew these people. They didn't even try to hide themselves. And many of us worked as domestic servants in their homes or as nannies, or we cleaned their offices, or we stocked their stores. We knew who these people were, yet they came and killed us and burned down everything and drove us away. How can people be so mean? She kept saying. And we had quite a discussion about it that night. Because this really is a difficult topic for Unitarian Universalists, because we always say we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of everyone, which implies that we believe that people are inherently good. Now, of course, we do believe that we have choice, and that there's always a danger that we are going to succumb to the evil side of human behavior. Now, I told you about the fear and racism of the times of the early 1920s, and that might be an explanation of why it happened so much, but it's certainly not an excuse as to why so many people chose that side of human behavior. And then the massacre itself, it's a mob behavior of thousands of people at one time succumbing to the evil side of human behavior. But then on top of that, and this is really what we're getting at in today's topic, it was hiding the truth, keeping the untold story of the Tulsa massacre a secret for almost 100 years. That in and of itself, it doesn't give anybody any accountability, any reconciliation, any healing. That's almost as bad as the massacre itself. So I started thinking theologically, what power are we as Unitarian Universalists accountable to? And it came up in this case with the power of truth. And it comes up in 2 of our principles. The obvious one, it states it right there, the 4th principle. We talk about a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Now, usually when I read that, or we read it in services, we're talking about the fact that we have all these 6 sources and world religions and humanist thought where we feel that we are compelled, actually, to have a reasonable, responsible search of all these sources of wisdom to see what is meaningful and true to ourselves in our spiritual journeys and our ethical journeys. But in this case, it's talking about the truth of justice or injustice in society, that it's a responsible search for what's really going on out there and what really is the truth. But then it's coupled with our sixth principle, which is we lift up the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. It's a utopic society that we're building and searching for. And so in this case, if we know the truths of injustices that are out there and say nothing because we're afraid, we don't want to be bothered, we're not doing anything towards that goal of world community. You can't have a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all when the stories out there are fake or not even told. So I believe that telling untold stories, like we're talking about today, is a theological imperative for us. Now, how do we live into this theology? Well, I was involved with the Humanity Project in Fond du Lac for the whole last year, and Judy Goldsmith was one of the founders of it. And I thought, well, what a better person to have him come and tell her story and her perspective on this topic than to share with us today and how we live into this theology. So I'm going to let you go away with it, Jody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Most of you are aware, well, actually we're all aware of and concerned about the recent killings of Black men by police officers, which has become a stark and relentless reality of our lives. And I say recent only in the sense that the development of cell phones has allowed for the filming of such incidents. One such incident occurred on April 19th in 2015, and it changed my life. That was the day that Freddie Gray died. And I didn't know him, but he was a Black man who lived in Baltimore. He was walking along the street when he was stopped by police officers for no apparent reason, though they later alleged that they found a small penknife on him. They beat him brutally. They dragged him to the police van, there was video of this, and they really had to carry him. His head was hanging down on his chest, his arms hung loosely at his sides, and his feet dragged along the ground. If he was conscious, there was no indication of that. They tossed him into the police van with his hands handcuffed behind his back, shut the door, and gave him what Baltimore police called a rough ride. He had no way to secure himself inside the van as it sped through the streets of Baltimore, taking the corners at high speed. When they arrived at the police station, he was unresponsive, so they took him to the hospital where he was pronounced dead of spinal fractures and a broken neck. The Black community in Baltimore was shocked and outraged, of course. They demonstrated, smashed some windows, and burned some buildings. Here in Fond du Lac, I heard a couple of people who were discussing this saying, well, slavery ended 200 years ago. Why don't they just get over it? I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I thought to myself, do they really believe that? Do they really think that everything was just fine after slavery ended? And finally, I had to acknowledge that, yes, they did think that. They think that because they didn't know what happened. Our schools certainly never taught about these things. Of course, the schools taught that slavery happened, but that it was bad, but never anything like the full reality. And the impact of that was brutal reality on the lives of the people enslaved and on the generations that followed. It is shocking now to find out how completely the history of slavery has been simply eliminated from our history books, as completely as if someone took scissors and clipped that part of the history out of our books. And why? Of course, because it was an embarrassment. It didn't reflect well on our image of ourselves, so they thought to hide it. Other countries have done this differently. Germany, for example, after struggling with their own history after World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, decided after 40 years to come up and to own up and acknowledge it. They made that difficult decision tangible, visible through teaching the real history, through monuments to the millions of dead, to statues, brass plaques embedded in the sidewalks where people had been dragged out of their homes. They acknowledged their racist past. Never again, they said, never again will this happen. We still haven't done that in this country. Instead, we still have statues honoring people who fought to keep a way of life that not only allowed the institution of slavery, but glorified it. We thought we could hide it, but we know that you really cannot hide things, not forever. Think of Tulsa. Most people, even people who live in Tulsa, didn't know until recently, 100 years later, that in 1921, thousands of people from white Tulsa attacked the pleasant neighboring middle-class Black neighborhood of Greenwood. Reverend Jim has cataloged for you some of the horrors that occurred on that day. All in all, it is estimated that white people of Tulsa killed at least 300 Black people and that day and wounded many more. In addition, they caused 10,000 people from Greenwood to flee, homeless and many penniless. Because the white community in Tulsa were embarrassed to have others learn what they had done, they hid stories of burning and massacre, even deleting articles about it from the newspapers. But of course, you can't hide such things. As we know, the truth will out, always, even if it takes 100 years. As I said, Freddie Gray's death shocked me into action. And since for most of my adult life I've been a teacher in one way or another, my first instinct was to teach. I said to myself, people have to learn. They have to know what really happened. And because we don't know, our ignorance is hurting people. We need to learn about these realities so that we can help to stop the violence and the discrimination and the pain that lives in so many hearts. Yes, we have been ignorant, but we know that ignorance never serves us well. And it is clear that, as the English Unitarian philosopher James Martineau once said, we are each of us responsible for the evil we might have prevented. I'll say that again. We are each of us responsible for the evil we might have prevented. So after the death of Freddie Gray, a group of us in the community came together. There were 8 of us initially, and we were Black, of mixed race, Latina, Indigenous, Hmong, and white, male and female. We decided to join together to do what we could to address these old and deeply rooted problems and bring them to the attention of the community. We called the program the Humanity Project, telling the untold story. And that's what we attempted to do. In short, we developed a series of programs to show videos about the history we had never learned, and we had thoughtful, respectful discussions about that history. What began as a series of discussion groups developed recently into a very exciting new version of the Humanity Project, telling the untold story, with a new group of very creative and dedicated people, including some from the original Humanity Project group. Restarted the program, this time via Zoom. The result was outstanding. The team leaders have presented to over 160 people this year, meeting once a month. We are very proud of that program. And as far as we are aware, there's no other place in the state that is offering this important opportunity to the community to learn about each other and break down barriers. People have been changed by the experience and gratified to learn that they now realize they were never taught. This is just a start, but we think it's safe to say that it's making a real difference in our community, and we all learn from each other, that we are a community of related human beings with far more in common than there is that separates us. We have high hopes for the Humanity Project. It helps people to understand what has been a mystery until now, and we're starting to see and understand each other as people. One thing that Martin Luther King said is very relevant to the Humanity Project program. He said, quote, people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. The Humanity Project offers that opportunity and there's that responsibility to communicate. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Judy. We are each of us responsible for the evil we might have prevented. That's an amazing quote. And I want to use that quote and refer back to a description I had in the reading, that little quote about the scene that was going on in the opening of The Watchmen. The very last part of that description talked about the newspaper that was tattered and laying on the ground on the street with the title, "To Lynch Negro Tonight," because there's a Unitarian connection there. And it's another untold story I think you need to know. It's the story of the Tulsa Tribune newspaper and its owner and very strong editor. He made sure he had a lot to do with all the content in the newspaper, was Richard Lloyd Jones. It's probably a name you don't know anything about, but he was the son of a very famous Unitarian minister, Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones, who was a very prominent Unitarian minister in Chicago. And Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones spent his life building up new Unitarian congregations in the city. He was very much involved in building community centers, especially for those that were marginalized and recent immigrants. He did a lot with the World Council of Churches, helped found it, and he's most famous for his peace activism. He, in fact, right leading up to World War I, he chartered a boat and filled it with peace activists from the United States, and they sailed over to Copenhagen, Denmark for a conference right before World War I was to start, to try to plead with the world not to go into war. So that's the kind of family that Richard Lloyd Jones grew up in. And you would think that he would exhibit a lot of the same kind of characteristics. And it's kind of ironic that I'm delivering this sermon on Father's Day, because the author of the book, The Burning, kind of alluded to the fact that Richard Lloyd Jones was probably not a favorite child of Jenkins Lloyd Jones, that he really struggled to get his father's approval and love. And throughout his adult life, he kept trying different endeavors, including owning a newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin for a while, and he kept failing at a lot of things until he finally moved to Tulsa and bought the failing Tulsa Tribune newspaper. Now, this was going to be a struggle because there was already the Tulsa World was the dominant newspaper in town. So to be able to be successful and make money and sell papers, he turned it into a tabloid. It had to be a sensationalist newspaper filled with fake news to be able to sell copies and make a profit. In fact, it is Richard Lloyd Jones who took the story of a young Black man and a young white woman where something happened, and the police even dismissed it as probably nothing. He turned it into a story of rape and got the entire community in an uproar and really fueled that idea of we need to lynch people to teach them a lesson. It was a story of abandoning his responsible search for truth and meaning and using fake news for personal gain at the expense of the entire Greenwood neighborhood, 10,000 African Americans. Now, he probably wasn't directly responsible for the riot. I think he was probably asleep in his bed that night. But that headline and his newspaper certainly poured the gasoline on the combustible climate at the time, and he might as well have handed the white mob a box of matches. It's a case in which someone very influential could have chosen to tell the truth, to take on the responsibility of preventing an evil, but he didn't. So 100 years later, I need to also tell you the story about All Souls Unitarian Church in Tulsa. All Souls Tulsa is the largest physical congregation of Unitarian Universalists in North America. And the very year they were founded was 1921, at the same time as this massacre. And one of the co-founders and the very first president of the congregation was, you guessed it, Richard Lloyd Jones. So there's a very huge connection to this congregation for what happened in Tulsa. Well, today, that congregation is a very integrated congregation, very multicultural, and they have really taken it on. Once they found out the story and their connection to it, they have been leaders in that city to try to reconcile what happened, to try to find accountability, to try to have healing. And they're making a major step right now. They needed to expand their building anyway because they're such a large congregation. And instead of just adding on to it in the white, wealthy suburban neighborhood that they're in since the 1950s, they made a decision to move back downtown in a block right next to the Greenwood neighborhood and with a new, larger building design, but they've saved about a quarter of the block to build a memorial garden to those who suffered in the Greenwood riot and the Tulsa massacre from back then. So they are stepping up 100 years later to try to make a difference and tell the untold story in a very big way. So I want to leave you then with the discussion questions so you can think about them while we have our musical selection at the end. Let me get that going. So think about these. Are there examples of untold stories which were eventually made public in your community? So wherever you live, do you know untold stories which eventually came out in your community? Or do you personally know of untold stories which you feel should come out? And if you can briefly describe the context without breaking confidentially, please do so. Now, I also wanted to list today, I'd like you to do more to learn this story. So again, the book that informed this whole sermon is The Burning, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 by Tim Madigan. But there are numerous documentaries out there, a couple of which were launched the night of the 100th anniversary. They're on the History Channel, MSNBC did a whole series, and CBS and others. Just search Tulsa Massacre and you can find them. So with that, I want to leave you a closing and hopefully a hope for the future. May we continue to work for a world without untold stories of evil, and one in which stories of resilience, peace, justice, and true liberty for all are proclaimed in the news. Amen.